It was a Saturday morning in Savannah. After a breakfast of yellow and white eggs, thick ham, and enormous biscuits and coffee, Suge donned his beret to head down to the waterfront to play his harmonica as he had the night before. It was his morning off. The night before he had played under the streetlight, under the dark and festive atmosphere of River Street. The night sky was watchful as the people were passing, enjoying his music and making contributions. After 3 hours of playing, Suge made his way toward home, sharing his contributions as usual with the street folk and street performers as he went. Then he took an alleyway or two in a detour to the part of the historic district where an old 3-story wooden frame Victorian home stood in the darkness. The moss from the live oak in the yard hung straight down, unmoving in the damp night in front of the house that was lonely, lovely, strapped in shadow and waiting. Its front porch and door a vacant, shadowed, closed mouth to a new generation that would need a small fortune to cross those floorboards now. A for sale sign, $3,500,000, was on the front iron gate, and despite the current value of the property, Anthony knew there were no security cameras. He knew the house like he knew his own self. After all, he had been raised in that house by his grandmama, Queenie Royal, had skated on its wood floors in his sock feet, and had pestered Queenie for bits of raw biscuit dough as he stood with her in the kitchen as she baked for a house full of tenants. His grandmama had passed away while he was in the service, and the absent elderly landlord had as well. When Anthony had returned from the service, he had met the realtor on a sentimental revisit to the house. He had ended up helping the realtor with some chores around the place, and he knew where the key to the home was. Anthony let himself in with the skeleton key for the door that he knew was in a fake rock under the porch. There was no realtor lockbox. The sound of the front door opening echoed against the wood floors and ceiling and air of the old place. The old, heavy wooden door went ka-chunk as it closed, announcing the sound of Anthony's cautious arrival over the threshold to the entryway and to the rooms and stairs and hallways of an enormous, dark and empty home. Stripes and blocks of moonlight shone onto the hardwood floor through tall, curtainless windows that rose to the ceiling on the bare living room floor. With the front door behind him, he looked up the stairs toward the second floor. Then Anthony closed his large, deep eyes and waited for the feeling to come over him, the mysterious, beautiful feeling of spirit. He listened in the quiet, to the quiet. He listened for any sound, eyes still closed, as his brain drank in the delicious, powerful atmosphere of the past there in the dark. Thoughts of his grandmama Queenie that he felt here still, in the breath and space and air, washed over him. He felt her personality in old wooden rooms and hallways he had known so well, felt the power of the memory of it in the part of his brain behind his forehead. He opened his eyes, and they drank in the sight of dust motes dancing crazily in the moonbeams that had found their way into the stripes on the floors and walls. His nose began to perceive tiny wisps of grandmama's rose perfume, blended with the essence and atmosphere of the tenants they had shared their lives with. He felt so much different there, so much wonder, but also felt obliged to visit grandmama there, because to him she was not in the cemetery. Yes, he felt that she visited there in the house. "This is for you, Grandmama," Anthony called out to the house and up the vacant staircase looking. He pulled out his harp and he played. The sound of it split through the house and echoed and bounced against rail, sill, and ceiling. When he had finished, he smiled. He was not alone. Couldn't be. A floorboard creaked somewhere. "This is for all you ghosts," he called out, and he began to play again. He could feel the attention of a silent energy on him, as if others peered over the banister from the upstairs hallway and peeked from the doors of rooms. Mr. Pittman, the prim, bald, fussy, and mysterious bespectacled gentleman from the second floor. Miss Thornby, the nervous spinster across the hall from Mr. Pittman. And Isadora, the mentally challenged little white girl that Grandmama lovingly raised as well. Isadora had been abandoned by her mother, a former dweller. The mother of the poor child had simply up and left one night and never returned for her little girl. It had taken Grandmama Queenie most of the next day to realize that the child had been abandoned, and the police and social services had asked Queenie to look after the child until her mother could be found. Since the child had spent most of her time following Queenie from room to room and chore to chore anyway, she had already grown to love the child. It didn't feel like much of an imposition for her to take the child on, and she was given an allowance by the state to do so. And Anthony had gained a sister. Anthony thought he saw Isadora standing there at the top of the stairs, blue ribbon in her hair and a smile on her too chubby, innocent little face, eyes slightly crossed but observant and looking down the length of the stairs to watch Anthony. These were the faces and people, and many more besides, the residents that Anthony could almost see again. Although he was no misanthrope, it was as if he were more comfortable with the subtle energy of the ghosts than the living folk. As quiet as cats, it was there, other than Anthony's notes of homage, but it still held a world for him so different from the busy, noisy Friday nights of Savannah every Friday night, with its sound of trolleys and horse carriages and music from bars, so different. His brain turned a corner, switched to another reality that he found beautiful, private, in a life so filled with co-workers, tourists, and patrons. It was a welcomed and soothing change. It was a lockbox of spirit, all his own, his lockbox. Anthony played beautifully then, for them, for the ghosts, and the ghosts listened. Anthony spent close to an hour in the house, his energy replenished. He got ready to leave. As his hand went for the antique knob of the door, he heard a soft, gentle voice, a murmur really. "Have you come home, Anthony? Have you come home?" Anthony looked over his shoulder, but he was not alarmed. He gazed at the child for a while until she vanished. "Good night, y'all," he answered back in his kindly manner, as he tipped his beret and ducked out the door, locking it behind him. This is the thing that Anthony had done that Friday night and many Friday nights before. How could he know that his life was to change the very next morning, and that the spirits would soon grow to be neglected? But this was not going to be unusual for them as they crazily passed time, folded into the wood and walls and mirrors of the old house, with only glimpses into a world they once knew but did no longer. Their souls were accustomed to neglect and to the madness of neither here nor there, but they had come to appreciate the gift of harmonic song that reached their forlorn psyches from time to time in the house and during strange times, and the notes would spark a tiny memory of warmer days of brightness and of breath when there had been hope and the normalcy of living in another dimension, another time. That time now collapsed away and locked forever, save for the occasional whisper of a melody that came from the walls. The next day found a discouraging sky over Savannah's historic district. It was a Saturday morning, and the cobblestones outside were slick and wet with cold. After his breakfast, Anthony, Sugar Poppa, donned his burgundy beret to head on down to the river street to play his harmonica, as he had the night before. It was his morning off. He saw his breath misting in the air before him as he reached the spot in front of the shops at the east end. He took his place and stood between the cold and thickly flowing river and the shops along the south wall of the buildings that made up River Street. The sun broke through. As he began his warm-ups on the harmonica, a beam landed on his beret. He suddenly had the impulse to play Raspberry Beret by Prince, and he struck the notes. "She wore a raspberry beret," he sang out to the nearly empty streets in his perfect throaty way, pealing out a harp accompaniment at pauses in the song. A woman, a shopkeeper from the shop across from him, appeared at the open door, smiling at the solitary concert. Still early for most folks, she had been setting up the round silver-plated racks outside her store with the sale T-shirts on them. When Anthony had finished his performance, she stood, smiling and clapping in the doorway. She was an exotic-looking lady with a roundish face, about 30-ish, wearing a kind smile. Anthony's tall frame bowed in response, his beautiful wide white teeth beaming on the stones of the square that was now steaming with sunshine. This is the type of thing that kept him coming back to do this. He enjoyed bringing folks pleasure. As he continued to play various pieces, he noticed the woman resume her work of dragging out the circles of T-shirts to display on the sidewalk. His lungs filled with fresh Georgia and riverfront air, and the sun began to join the revelry in stripes. The woman at the T-shirt shop, still working, turned her back to Anthony as she worked on a rack, and as she did, her long, dark hair became visible as it swung in a heavy, shining curtain against the back of her T-shirt. Anthony was suddenly stunned at the sight of that hair and felt a sudden punch to his stomach. He continued to play as he watched the woman work, her hair like silk spilling forward as she bent, or swaying as she moved the T-shirts, arranging them by size or color, and it seemed as though the sun had sought out to illuminate her in a way that Anthony had not noticed in people before, in women before. It was as though this woman shone from within. And that is how, just looking at her as he was playing his harmonica, nearly 50-year-old Anthony Sugar Poppa Cleveland fell in love for the first time ever. Ever. End of part 3.